How's everybody doing? This is Adam Mason with the host of the Beer to Talk podcast. Super excited for this episode. And I just want to say thank you guys again for listening, for your feedback, for following along on Instagram. And we are reaching some fun little goals that are happening. We're also redoing all of our show notes so that all of the show notes from each episode will be similar to a blog post, which will be really, really good and have a lot of content. So if you like listening or reading or like notes or like the links, we're just going to put out that content. We're spending the money. We're pushing it out. It's going to be absolutely awesome. Today, we have a buddy of mine who's amazing. I've been on his podcast called Bokeh Podcast on episode 90. But this guy is super awesome. He's a Renaissance man, does a lot of different things, which I love. And that's my buddy Nathan Holrtiz. And he is the owner and founder of Photographer's Edit, which is a customizable image editing service for wedding photographers like myself and portrait photographers as well. It's super cool. I've tried out a bunch, and his is the most intuitive. And we talk about this in the episode, but he does so much to get to know you guys and get to know your editing style, your vibe, kind of like, does this fit with my brand? And I love that. That's a personal approach, which is really cool because when you're outsourcing, it can feel kind of like skeevy or nerve-wracking, or like, we just got a logo made for a project on Fiverr, and it worked out, but we knew we weren't expecting some magical thing, and it just felt like I was chatting with an Uber driver. And so Nathan has the opposite approach to that when it comes to editing. So it's really, really cool. He's the host of the Bokeh podcast, which I talked about, and that is really, really fun because I know we all have lots of podcasts to listen to, but he's been around for a while. Both of our podcasts came out at a time when there were not a lot of photography podcasts, and his is more about blurring the lines between personal and the business aspects of being a professional photographer. So really, really cool. Love that guy. Without any further ado, here's Nathan Holrtiz. Nathan, how's it going, man?
It's going quite well. Thank you so much for having me on, Adam.
Awesome, man. You're are you out in Tennessee, right?
I am. I'm in Chattanooga, or the Chattanooga area, and so we're about 2 hours from Nashville, about 2 hours from Atlanta. I think a lot of times it gets confused with Nashville, and we're actually a separate city about 2 hours away.
You're like, we're separate people. You don't know who we are.
Yeah, I got to have a little bit of identity, right?
Yeah. Don't they, isn't there part of Tennessee too that are you in the different time zone, or is it not?
We're in the Eastern time zone, and Nashville is in Central. Yeah. So that's another kind of funny element. I have a good friend, Zach Gray, up in Nashville. And so if we ever get together to ride motorcycles, we have to figure out the difference in time zone to accommodate those kind of, where we're coming from. So
that's awesome. That is hilarious. It's growing up in the small state of Delaware on the East Coast, had a lot of benefits. And one of those was, with the same area code for the entire state for when you called people, and it was it's the same time zone, but Tennessee problems. And I think Indiana has a time change in the state. And so, yeah, you're in one of those, what we would say is a weird state, but I'm sure it's fine for you guys.
Yeah, it is kind of a funny thing. But ultimately, so much of what I do in the photo industry isn't limited just to Chattanooga. It's very much a national and even international venture, if you will. So I'm constantly having to accommodate different time zones. It really isn't too much of an issue in the end.
Totally. So we talked about Photographer's Edit in the pre-show and how you do Bokeh podcast, and you are one of the people that I kind of look up to, and you very much represent where I think I'll be in the next few years. But I don't think I'm going to start an editing company by any means, but you do a few different things, which is really fun. And you're a photographer that's been through a journey of, shooting full time and shooting, a crazy amount of weddings. And now I think you told me before in the pre-show that you shoot like one wedding a year, maybe, or your second shoot or something like that. So tell me a little bit of your story. Like, how'd you get into photography and business, and walk me through and kind of catch me up to today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, those are very generous words, and I appreciate that. I'm stoked to hang out with a fellow podcaster today, so that's kind of fun. But I'll explain a little bit about Bokeh in just a second. Photography itself was something that I just kind of fell into, not necessarily by accident, but I think just like a lot of photographers, it was something that I enjoyed. And honestly, if I were to kind of really analyze where I was in life at the time, which is I was only 21 when I shot my first wedding. It was one of those things where I was going down a different path that was largely influenced by my parents. And I was even going to school in that particular realm. And I very simply opted out of it and saw photography as an out. And photography was something I actually wanted to do versus feeling like I had to kind of follow the pressure of my parents or otherwise. And so I happened to get what seemed like a nice SLR, film SLR at the time, and started taking a bunch of pictures with it. My partner at the time put together a portfolio of images from those rolls of film that I had shot. And a friend of mine saw that portfolio, recommended me to their friends who were getting married, or to his friends who were getting married. And I ended up getting to photograph that wedding. And that was one of those things where it just, it was not necessarily on a whim. I had much time to prep in advance to kind of read about wedding photography and think about how I was going to approach the day. And I think at one point I even got a chance to talk to a wedding photographer at a wedding that I attended, but I just jumped in. And fortunately, the clients were happy. And while I didn't really make any money from that first venture, it gave me the beginnings of a portfolio, which then enabled me to shoot about 15 weddings in the next year and a half or so. The following year after that, I shot about 30, and things just kind of took off. And so I shot full-time, but part-time and full-time for a little over 10 years.
Wow. That's insane.
Well, it's kind of crazy to look back on, and in some ways it seems like another time in my life, like a whole different life ago. But it ultimately certainly gave me a creative outlet. It also gave me an outlet for experimenting with being an entrepreneur, which I realized, and this is kind of the major fast-forwarded version, but I realized was more my interest, to borrow a cliche term, my passion. And so I realized that photography wasn't going to be the end-all be-all for me. And I also wanted to create a business, a company that would give me even more freedom and flexibility than I already had as a photographer. And I was at the time, actually, that I came up with the idea for Photographer's Edit, the editing company that I'm an owner of. I was reading Tim Ferriss's The 4-Hour Work Week, and it was interesting to see the similarities between our thought processes. And this was a company in Photographer's Edit that I was looking to start that would give me something that we call passive income. And ultimately, again, long story short, within the span of 2 to 3 years, I was able to work as little as 4 hours a week. And my company continued to grow. And of course, there's a much kind of longer, deeper story there. But Photographer's Edit came from a place of interest, certainly in entrepreneurship, but also a desire to have more freedom and flexibility in my life. And not only, fortunately, did it give me that benefit, but ultimately what it now does is it enables me to give that benefit to other photographers. We literally give photographers their lives back, their time back, by handling what is really the most time-consuming element of running a photography business. So it's kind of cool how that's come full circle. But that's the very, very short version of the story.
I love that. Now, when you were transitioning into Photographer's Edit, was that like a sudden transition and you were like, all right, this is my last wedding, starting this company, or was that kind of overlapping? And then the second question is, eventually, was it difficult to give up the idea of being a full-time photographer? And, there's always that kind of, I imagine there's that lapse of people emailing you and texting you and saying, hey, Nathan, do you still do XYZ? Or, hey, will you shoot my wedding? And you're like, oh, I would, but it's just not me anymore, or it's not what I do. Like, what was that transition like? And was it difficult? Because you did that for a long time. And I feel like a lot of us, even if you make it as a photographer, we're like, all right, I'm done. Like, I want to stay like this forever. And things have changed for you. So what was that transition like?
That's an interesting question. 2008 was when we officially started Photographer's Edit. And it took, as I mentioned earlier, 2 to 3 years to really get it off the ground. I mean, it was a process of refining workflow and ultimately being able to consistently or more consistently provide a finished product that photographers were happy with. And so that was a pretty involved process. That was 2008 when we started. It wasn't until 2012 that I stopped shooting full time. And in fact, 2012 was the last time that I actually photographed a wedding for my company. And since then, I have had the opportunity to second shoot a number of times with my friend Thomas Flint, who's a really talented photographer, just an incredible human being who is out of New York. And that gives me a creative outlet and an opportunity to hang out with a friend. But that's about the extent of my photography these days. I did have the opportunity to photograph my cousin's wedding not too long ago out in Seattle. That was a really cool opportunity. It was funny how, after shooting hundreds of weddings over the span of 10 plus years, you develop a certain muscle memory, and it all just came flooding back. And it was really an enjoyable process to be in the game again temporarily. But that transition honestly wasn't a difficult one for me, because photography was kind of a means to an end, and that end was entrepreneurship. Again, if we're looking at it top down in a very, very simple level. So the transition wasn't so difficult. Of course, running a company like Photographers Edit, I don't have the same creative outlet that I did with photography, or at least the same type of creative outlet. But there are certain things that I get to be involved in the day-to-day that are kind of creative in nature. So I'm in the process right now of working on projects changes for 2019, and part of what is innate to those changes is design and workflow, design and actual UI, user interface for the website. And getting to think through those processes is really, really enjoyable for me. I'm not a designer by nature. We've had the opportunity to work with Davey and Krista Jones, who did a website revamp for us earlier this year, actually. And so ultimately, I have to defer to specialists like themselves for design, but I still have a creative outlet, and that's enjoyable. But entrepreneurship and ultimately creating a life of flexibility for myself is really where it's at. So whether that's photography or running an editing company or starting another business of some kind, that's kind of my end goal when it comes to running a business.
Now, does that for you? I always say that for entrepreneurs, what we find ourselves doing, like whatever craft it is more just an expression of who we already are. So like, I already know you because we're friends, but you're definitely a guy who loves to serve. And so through photography, you're able to do that. And then Photographers Edit is, just another way that you can actually, serve people, help other photographers, help businesses, help more people. And so, it's kind of like, it's just the new expression of who Nathan already was, or already who Nathan's already becoming. So I love that. That's awesome.
Thank you. And that's intuitive of you to notice that. But yeah, really, Photographers Edit plays on two principles, or not even principles, two big ideas that are extremely important to me. One is time, and the other is relationships. So of course, the company came from a place where I wanted more time in my life for the sake of relationships with my family. And now, not only does it still give me that type of flexibility, but it also gives me the opportunity to provide time in the lives of photographers for the sake of the relationships in their lives. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, it's exciting to be part of a company that is growing. We're seeing incredible growth right now, but numbers on their own to me don't matter as much as, to your point, having the opportunity to be able to serve and help people. And at the end of the day, I get to do both. I get to be part of a company that's growing because I think we're doing some really great things. But at the same time, we have the opportunity to truly make a difference on a very deep level in people's lives. And that is just so incredibly rewarding. And Bokeh, you mentioned the podcast earlier, has been kind of an outgrowth of that idea too. I wanted an opportunity to be able to kind of reconnect with the industry. I went through some stuff personally for a period of time during which I kind of pulled back from the industry and wasn't as communicative, if you will. And so the podcast gave me an opportunity to come back to the industry, have conversation on a kind of a one-on-one or one-on-two basis, which I really enjoy. And it also gave me an opportunity to be able to create content that would hopefully be valuable for the industry. And it's a soft sell for Photographers Edit. Everybody's kind of trained to create content for the sake of ultimately driving business. And while I get that idea, I didn't want to just simply create the same content that everybody else was creating. I could create blog posts around the idea of workflow and saving time and so forth. And that just seemed like I was copying other people. The podcast platform was something a little bit different that not a lot of businesses were doing, specifically in the industry. And we've had the opportunity now to put out close to 200 episodes of content around photography, business, and saving time. And it's been really rewarding to hear from photographers about how the podcast is making a difference in their lives. So again, to your point, it's an opportunity to pour into other people, and it's so extremely rewarding in the end.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So for Photographers Edit, I want to get like a little bit nerdy just for the photographers who are listening. And I know we've talked about outsourcing, and it's a topic that a lot of people, if you go to a workshop, you're hearing from somebody who is a little bit more experienced than where you're at most of the time as a new photographer sometimes, or a new business owner. And they say, outsource, and, try and get your editing and all that stuff. And I think it's totally fine. I think it's awesome. So tell me practically though, how does it work at least for Photographers Edit? Give me the practical dumbed down version for folks who've never done that, who maybe they barely know how to use Lightroom, or they just know to use it themselves. Like, walk us through kind of the nerdy details just for fun, so people can kind of feel like, oh, this isn't too overbearing. This isn't too scary to hand off my catalog for somebody.
Yeah. And again, it's a good question. And I like the way that you present that the simple version, right? Because at the end of the day, we all have so much to keep up with. The last thing we need is a complicated process to get in the way of just getting done what we need to, so we can actually sit down at the end of the day and hang out with our family or watch some Netflix or whatever the case may be. So the simple version, Photographers Edit, is custom editing for wedding and portrait photographers, or event and portrait photographers. And because the photographer's style is such an important part of what we do, we've tried to, and actually are continuing to, refine the process of being able to share that editing style with us, with our editing teams, so that we can effectively match that editing style. So the first thing that happens when you create an account is that you share your editing style with us. Now, if you don't have something specific in mind that you're already applying to your images on your end, we give you a couple of styles to choose from that we've created for you. So that means getting started takes literally seconds. But if you have a particular style that you're currently editing your images with, then we've created a platform that makes it easy to share that style with us. So you'll share anywhere from 8 to as many as 16 before after examples, images straight out of the camera, those same images processed the way that you normally would with our team, so that we have a visual reference. Because the funny thing about a photographer saying, for example, that I like a warm white balance, well, that can mean 100 different things to 100 different photographers. So having a visual reference for our team is really, really important. So that's the first step in that process. And then if you use a particular Lightroom preset, whether you've created that yourself or you've purchased it elsewhere, if you use a particular preset to process your images, color or black and white or both, we give you a space to upload those as well. And then the third step is to go ahead via text, communicate additional details about your editing style, because that's still an element of that editing style, right? What is your white balance preference? What is your contrast preference? What is your exposure preference? And we're able to then kind of compare those notes with the visual references that you've given us. And of course, additional notes about cropping and culling and maybe straightening and crop. Did I already mention cropping? I think I said that a couple of times. Black and white conversion, and maybe even more detailed notes about the color correction process. We all kind of have our own thing that we do. So we give you plenty of space to give us that information. And then with that, we have an editing style that is representative of your brand. So when we go to process and order, it's not just kind of random color correction. We're actually processing to match your editing style. And that's the gist of it, honestly. The sending of those files to us is extremely simple. You send a Lightroom catalog file with what are called smart previews, which are like mini RAW files, roughly a tenth the size of regular RAW files. So it's easy to just put them in Dropbox and send us a link. We send a finished catalog back to you. You open it up, connect the catalog to your RAW files or your JPEG files if you shoot JPEG. And you can see the work from our team render on those images. It's almost like magic. It's kind of fun. And then do what you will with those images from there. But it's actually, once you get your account set up, and even the process of setting up your accounts, it's a very, very simple process that doesn't take a lot of time. And the cool thing is it ultimately saves you a ton of time.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome. It's something too where I think like a lot of photographers look at it and they're like, oh, this is kind of nerve wracking. But how much you do up front to get to know the photographers and their style and, kind of their overall preference. Obviously, there's that 1% or 5% of where we might go crazy on an image that look different. Or, I always joke about like when I shoot Nikon, so I shoot very underexposed all the time anyway. But there's some photos where I'm like, oh, this will be a silhouette. This is how I planned it to be a silhouette. And then there are times when you're editing and you're like, oh, this would be really great if I could bring it up. Or vice versa. You shoot a photo and you're like, oh, this would make a good silhouette. But other than that, that's a kind of rare case. And so lots of photographers, especially if they've established their personal workflow in general, it's so much easier to hand off to you guys and to make sure that works. That's really, really cool. And so what is the kind of general turnaround time, at least for you guys? What's that exciting time that photographers, I hear they say, it takes them 8 weeks to edit a wedding or 12 weeks to edit a wedding. What does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, the average turnaround time for a portrait session is 3 business days. The average for a wedding is 5 business days. So most photographers, as you were saying, are going to take weeks to get their weddings edited, or maybe even a week or 2 for a portrait session. I realize there's always the exception to that rule. You always have that kind of overachieving photographer who's just really incredible with Lightroom. They can get through their sessions or their events really quickly. If that's the case, and it makes sense financially, when you're actually looking at the numbers, how much your time is worth, and you can turn it around in a couple hours and it's all said and done, more power to you. But that is the rare exception. 98, I'll throw out a number, 98% of photographers, that's not the case. That's not the situation. And so the idea that you can send a portrait session and have it back in a few days, or a wedding and have it back in a few days, you have the opportunity now, not only, of course, to save an incredible amount of time on your end and to allocate that time to things that are way more important to your personal life and to your business, but you also have the opportunity to just blow your clients away with the experience. Because these days, photography, you kind of alluded to this, Adam. I mean, the reality is that most of our clients don't really know the nuanced differences between decent photography and great photography. And at the end of the day, I mean, as we all know, art is so subjective anyway. So the idea that we are going to spend so much time editing our own work for the sake of maintaining control in a particular look, we know that only translates so much. Our end client isn't noticing those nuanced differences. What they are going to notice, though, is a different experience, right? When things are so easily accessible now to the end user, to the end client, we have to create a unique experience. That's what's largely going to enable us to set our brand apart. So part of that experience is turnaround time. And if you say to the client, hey, I'm going to deliver the wedding in 2 weeks, and then you blow them away, and when they're back from their honeymoon, that finished product is in their hands, that would be a really great experience. And so not only did they get great photography, but they also, and probably more importantly these days, had a really cool experience with you as the photographer, and they're going to be more apt to recommend you. So that's what the turnaround time looks like. But I do want to comment on one thing, because you brought up something really interesting that I think is a principle that is applicable across the board, whether you're outsourcing editing or anything else. But just as a CEO of your photography business, and that is the significance of actually 2 things. Number one, understanding your process well enough to be able to communicate it. So a lot of photographers will come to us not really understanding what it is that they want. They like a little bit of this here, a little bit of that there, and it is a bit more haphazard, a little bit more random. And so I think it's important, for the sake of your systems, for the sake of efficiently running a business, to understand what it is that your goals are and how to attain those goals. And that's certainly applicable when it comes to editing your images, processing your images. Once you have that process down, though, you have a good idea of it, then the significance of knowing how to communicate that to, whether it's an in-house assistant or a company like Photographers Edit, it can't be lost in this conversation. Because while, yes, outsourcing your editing is a massive time saver, it can make a massive difference in your life, an important element of that is the communication. And as a business owner, if you don't know how to communicate in order to delegate, your business probably won't flourish like it could. And so understand that as you develop a relationship with an editor, whether, again, it's an in-house editor or it's a company like Photographers Edit, you can't minimize the significance of communication. When you go to hand off those images, be very clear about what it is you want first, and then spend time communicating in great detail that process to your editor, to the editing company, and then understand that that communication is an ongoing process. I worked retail for years, and you never went and worked for a company where they just stuck you out on the floor and didn't talk to you. There was a process, there was training, and then there was ongoing communication. And you, the photographer, become the employer of Photographers Edit, the employee. And it's important to understand the significance of communication in that it's not a one-off, hey, here's my images, just go process them. You have to learn how to communicate the process and then on an ongoing basis give feedback. And we've built a really cool system that enables photographers to give feedback to us as well.
That's awesome. That's what I was going to ask about was feedback. Let's say they get back their magical, absolutely magical catalog, and maybe there's part of it that's just not as magical. What does that process look like for feedback? Is that something that does feedback stop as far as Lightroom goes, after you guys have delivered what you've delivered, and so it's up to the photographer to change? Like, how does that revision / feedback work?
Yeah, the reality of this process is that there is likely at some point in time, whether it's right away or down the road, you're going to get an order back that you're not totally stoked on. And it's not because we don't have an extremely, extremely talented editing team, or that we don't have a great process in place for handling communication, capturing your editing preferences. But we're human beings, and we happen to be extremely subjective in the way that we see things, especially as artist types. And so we may get an order back that maybe the contrast is off a little bit, or the white balance is slightly off, or like you pointed out earlier, Adam, it's actually a great example that the idea that you shot an image thinking it should be a silhouette, and the editor is trying to match exposure across a series of images. And so instead of processing it as a silhouette, they bump the exposure way too hot. And that kind of thing needs to be adjusted. Whatever the case may be, there's going to be an instance likely where you have to give some feedback. We have a really great system in the account dashboard. This kind of your control panel for your relationship with Photographers Edit. The order history, right next to that order that you placed, there are a series of emojis, actually 5 different emojis representing different feelings about this particular order, all the way from extremely stoked on the order to just not happy with it at all. And you click on the appropriate emoji, it takes you to a feedback page, and you can give us really specific feedback about that order. It's kind of funny. A lot of photographers are apprehensive about giving feedback. They actually feel bad giving feedback that isn't positive. We actually welcome any and all kinds of feedback. And that's largely so that we can continue to improve our relationship with the photographers. And the more feedback that we get, the better we can get for the photographer. And all of this feedback that we get is categorized and ordered, and we can actually, it enables us to hold the editor or the editing team accountable as well. So we take that feedback, we can make adjustments to that order. There's a little checkbox at the bottom of that feedback page after you've given us feedback, whatever it might be. Let's say white balance. We talked about white balance. You note that there's a processing issue or processing preferences issue. The white balance wasn't matched to your preferences. You give us a couple of examples, visual references again, and then you just check a little box that says redo my order. And 24 to 48 hours, you've got a fresh Lightroom catalog back. The issue's been fixed. Our team becomes better for it because we now have that feedback. We can hold the editor accountable, give them additional training if need be. And it's a win-win all around. The photographer doesn't have to spend time fixing the issue. And I think, again, therein lies part of the challenge when it comes to this idea of delegation, not just with editing, in that if you get something back or something is done that you're not totally stoked on, taking the time to communicate that, and using our feedback page just takes a few minutes, but taking the time to communicate that for the sake of that employee, Photographers Edit, getting better is really, really important, because down the road, it's going to save so much time. And we've put a system in place that enables them to do that very, very quickly, very succinctly, in a very organized fashion. And by the way, it also creates accountability for the photographer, because if they go and they say, hey, you know what, I'm not really stoked about this particular element of the order, they go to give us that feedback, and then they realize, oh, I didn't put that in my editing style page, my preferences. At that point, they can update their editing style page. We've enabled them to do that. And so for future orders, now that style has been updated. Our team can reference that. They know what it is the photographer wants, and the future orders should match that very style.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love that. Now, how big is Photographers Edit? Like, how big is your company, if you don't mind? Is it like 5 people? Is it 100 people? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, we've got, let's see, right now, the admin team, if you will, customer service and customer outreach. And I took on 2 business partners, and we have somebody who's kind of helping oversee operations. That's, I think, 8 of us now. And then our editing team it gets quite large. We've got over 100 in production, mostly on the culling and color correction side. But then we also have a number of editors in retouching as well.
That is incredible. That's incredible. So fill in some of the gaps for me just about your personal life. And you have 2 kids, right?
I do. Yeah. My kids, my son is 16. His name is Austin, and my daughter Addison is 13.
That's awesome. And you love to ride motorcycles, right? That's something we've bonded over.
I know. And I'm hoping at some point we have the opportunity to ride together. But yeah, that happened about 2.5 years ago. I got my license for really 2 primary reasons. One, to push myself outside my comfort zone a bit and live a little, if you will. And then the other 2 is an opportunity for, again, relationships, and more specifically, relationship with my family, my dad, who rides motorcycles. I have 3 younger brothers who all ride. And it's been a really cool opportunity. I mean, we have, if I look at my relationship with my 3 younger brothers and my dad, we all have differences of sorts, but motorcycles are a common denominator, and it enables us to be able to connect. And so, for example, earlier this year, we went and got to ride, most of us anyway, we spent some time in the hills of, I guess we were in Georgia technically, but we got to ride together and stay in this little cabin or house and spend some time together. It's an opportunity for relationships, and that's been really cool. But on the flip side of that, the exhilaration of riding. I mean, to go to a racetrack with a bike and run it 160 miles an hour down the straight, and then lean into a curve and be scraping your knee. I mean, this is the kind of intense exhilaration that you get from it as well. And aside from skydiving, it's really the most incredible thing that I've had the opportunity to do.
That is awesome. That's awesome. One of the guys, we're totally branching out of photography right now, but one of the buddies at our local motorcycle club in DC he goes to track days pretty often. And he was talking about how he wouldn't consider himself like a pro by any means, but he was like, the equipment can always go further than your mind thinks it's allowed to go.
100%.
And it's like the equipment was built, like to save your life and to make things happen. And like, I always joke with my parents, especially about the Harley, but almost all motorcycles work this way, and how, if you want the bike to stand up straight and to stabilize, you got to give it some gas. And, like if you give it gas, it most of the time will counteract and go back straight because of like it's pushing the front tire, and it's going to find like its happy medium. And, I've never, I ride a Harley. I don't think we're going to take our Harleys up to track day, but hopefully sometime Zach Gray and you and myself, and maybe we could find some other photographers who ride, and we'll have some kind of meetup or something, and it'll be fun.
Oh, we should totally do it. But it is a funny thing that, as much as, and it's kind of counterintuitive in some ways, that you think that you need to kind of control the motorcycle in order to keep it upright and be safe. And yet I think it's a beautiful metaphor for life, in that instead of trying to keep this thing up and alive and safe, if you just give it the gas and continue to move forward, it will stay upright. And it's an interesting lesson that I learned when I actually took my motorcycle safety course, but it continues to be, I think, a beautiful example for life. And that instead of trying to maintain control of every little thing all the time, if we just consistently move forward, things are going to be okay. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful picture.
I love it. I love it, man. So before we get you out of here, tell me some of the goals you have for 2019 or 2020. Like, what are you looking at right now? What are you consuming that's content wise that's kind of pushing you along or feeding your soul, if you will? Like, give me an insight to what's happening on 2019 for Nathan.
Yeah. Well, first of all, content is an interesting topic. It's easy to consume a ton of content. I still do, honestly, but I haven't, as of late, been consuming as much business-related content. And I think there is a business or self-help, actually, for that matter, because those are my tendencies. If I'm going to read a book or listen to a book, it's a self-help book or a business book.
Sure.
But there is also, I think it's also easy in 2018 in first world culture to consume so much content and then not really do a whole lot about it. And, we could say, hey, we read 100 books this year, but what does that actually mean? What does that translate to? How is that actually bettering your life? Or are you just doing it because it sounds good or it feels good or otherwise? So to be honest with you, at the moment, I'm not reading any nonfiction books. I'm actually reading some fiction, which has kind of been enjoyable. In the evenings, at times I'll read this fiction, and it's a means of kind of relaxing and something to do before I go to sleep.
That's awesome. What are you reading?
Well, it's a series called the Themis series, or the Themis series. And the simple version, and I have to say it this way just because it sounds hilarious, it's about alien robots. And it's, yeah, exactly. It's like the furthest thing from, again, what I would normally read. If I scroll through my Kindle library, it's just the kind of the antithesis of that. But it's been a really nice break to just not think too hard and to read in the evenings. I have a Kindle Paperwhite, which generates light in a way that is comparable to light bouncing off the page of a book. So instead of getting that blue light from an LCD, which can affect your ability to sleep well, you're able to use this light, which has this interesting reflective pattern, which is supposed to simulate sunlight bouncing off a book. And I'll turn all the lights off in my room, and I'll just read with that for a bit before I go to sleep. And that's been really, really nice. So content-wise, I'm not reading a lot of nonfiction at the moment. I try to stay up on industry news and tech news. And I also take in a little bit of design news and, of course, motorcycle news. But otherwise, it's more about pop culture and motorcycle stuff, kind of for fun. But it's interesting how that can kind of lend itself to doing business, too. It lends a different type of perspective. But as far as what I'm focusing on for 2019, there are a couple of things. One, when it comes to Photographers Edit, again, we've seen wonderful growth, and it's exciting. And I want to continue to play on what I think has driven that growth. And that largely centers around customer experience. We can offer editing services and do a really great job around that, but there are other companies that can do that as well. And there are plenty of names in the industry. But I think one of the things that we've done and will continue to work on and develop and build on is provide a good customer experience. And so that is, on a very, very big picture level, a very simple explanation, my focus for 2019 and what we're building our service around for 2019 largely centers around customer experience. And it might sound a little bit obvious, a little bit cliche, but honestly, these days in a world where we have easy access to any and everything that we need, but it's a push of a button. It's not an experience. I want to contrast that and to focus on low prices and so forth with an experience that just it makes people want to continue to come back. And we build a fan base versus just a list of clients. And so that's my focus for 2019 with Photographers Edit. The other thing I can't comment on a whole lot, but I'm pretty stoked about is I'm beginning to work on a new business, a new project, if you will. And it is a photography related project. Actually, really, there are kind of two projects innate to it, but a new business. And I get excited about new projects, new ideas, new businesses. But this could be a really, really big thing on multiple levels. And maybe when I have the opportunity to talk about that a little bit more, we can do that on air again. But that's something that's kind of in the works in the background right now. And you talk about creativity. We talked about this at the beginning of the podcast. The creativity innate to creating a new business and ideally or potentially a service is something that is just it gets me really, really excited. And so I'm getting to work on that as well.
That's awesome, man. I love it. So mysterious, though. So mysterious. We'll
I know that was pretty vague, wasn't it?
That's awesome, though. That's
I wish I could say more, but hopefully we'll have something a little bit more solid at the latest midway through the year, and be something that I'll be able to talk more about then.
That's awesome, man. Dude, so where can people go to find out more about you, the Bokeh podcast, and of course we'll link these in the show notes, but and also Photographers Edit? Like, where's the best place to find out more about all of that?
Yeah, well, very simply, I guess, Instagram for me personally, Nathan Holrtiz, Nathan, and then Holritz. You can see a little bit of business, a little bit of personal. What you're going to see, honestly, is just a lot of pictures of me with people. It is, for me, all about relationships in the end. And I enjoy that. And that's so much of what I enjoy about the photography industry. But Nathan Holrtiz on Instagram. And then Photographers Edit, if you just go to photographersedit.com, just like it sounds, Of course, you can learn more about our service there. And you can also follow us on Instagram, PHOTOGSEDIT, so Photogs Edit. And then the Bokeh Podcast has its own account, BOKEH Podcast, Bokeh Podcast on Instagram. And you can go to bokehpodcast.com and see all the episodes, again, close to 200 at this point, and all the show notes associated with those as well. And you can find that all at bokehpodcast.com.
That's awesome, man. I would encourage people to listen to episode 90. I'm not biased, but
100%.
It is the podcast. That was when we first chatted on Bokeh. So yeah, how to turn your passion into a sustainable business, which is a super big thing. So awesome, man. Seriously, so great to have you on. And I wish you well in 2019 as we head towards the end of this year. And seriously, man, so excited for you and hoping that people get some of their editing life back and with Photographer's Edit. So thank you so much for diving into that and kind of unpacking that for us, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Adam. It's been a privilege.
Well, that was a fun one. I know a lot of people are always interested in outsourcing their editing, getting their time back. And also Nathan's he's a good guy and a good family guy to learn a lot of perspective from. He's also a fellow podcaster, which is really fun. So I'd encourage you to go check out all of those things in the show notes, Photographer's Edit, the Bokeh Podcast, and just Nathan's personal life. Like, he's just a fun dude, which is really, really great. One call to action that I have for all of you guys is, we're not going to ask for anything else this week, is I would love if you shared this episode with a friend or someone who could just use a kind word of encouragement, or you can share the whole podcast with them. But I think it would mean a lot, one, that you're thinking of them, which is always really good, especially around this time of year. And then two, that you're giving them value and content that you've already unlocked and you thought was important. So I would love if you share this episode just with a friend, or share the podcast with a friend. We have good episodes on second shooting, or dealing with imposter syndrome, or getting out of scarcity mindset. There's a lot that's applicable. And that would be my super duper, please favor ask for this week. Just share this podcast with a friend. Thank you guys so much. You guys are awesome.